The hospital corridors were eerily silent, interrupted only by the rhythmic beeping of machines and the occasional footsteps of night shift nurses. Dr. Kevin stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the blood report in his trembling hands. This, this can't be real, he muttered, his heart pounding. But the numbers didn't lie. His blood was a perfect match for Lucas Brown, a critically ill patient whose family had spent generations looking down on people like him. A storm of emotions raged inside him. Could he put aside the years of prejudice and discrimination he'd faced and do what his profession demanded of him? Could he save the life of someone whose very family would never have accepted him as an equal? Meanwhile, Lucas's family grappled with a bitter truth. Was their hatred stronger than their love for their son? Would they rather lose him than accept help from a black doctor? This is not just a story of blood compatibility. It's a story of breaking barriers, of hatred clashing with humanity, and of hearts changing unexpectedly. Chapter 1. The Diagnosis. Dr. Kevin leaned against the cold white walls of the hospital, his fingers tightening around the medical file. The fluorescent lights above cast a stark glow on his weary face. Still, nothing could overshadow the storm brewing inside him. The report in his hand was clear. Lucas Brown, a young man in critical condition, needed an immediate blood transfusion, and out of all the possible donors, Kevin was the only match. He inhaled sharply, forcing himself to remain professional. He had taken an oath to heal, to save lives, no matter whose life it was. But this case was different. The name Brown carried a weight he couldn't ignore. The Browns were known throughout the town for their deep-seated racism. Kevin had seen their hateful stares in grocery stores and heard their slurs whispered in passing. And now, fate had placed Lucas's life in his hands. Meanwhile, in room 302, Lucas lay unconscious, his breathing shallow. Richard Brown's father paced the floor with clenched fists, while his mother, Margaret, sat frozen in a chair, her hands trembling. The doctors had just given them the news. Without a blood transfusion, Lucas wouldn't make it through the night. "Who's the donor?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp with desperation. Dr. James, Kevin's colleague, hesitated before answering. "Doctor?" "Kevin." The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard's jaw tightened, his face twisting in disbelief. "A black man? You expect me to let a black man's blood run through my son's veins?" His voice was laced with anger, but beneath it was fear. Fear of what accepting this help would mean. Margaret swallowed hard, her mother's instincts battling years of ingrained prejudice. "If it saves him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Richard turned away, gripping his forehead. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. In the hallway, Kevin stood outside the room, listening. He had expected resistance, but hearing it still stung. He had the power to save a life, but the question was, would they let him? Would he even want to? Chapter 2. The Dilemma. Dr. Kevin stood motionless outside room 302, listening to the hushed but intense conversation inside. Every fiber of his being told him to walk away, to let Lucas's family deal with their prejudices. They had spent years looking down on people like him. Now they needed his help. Would they accept it? And more importantly, did he even want to give it? His hands clenched into fists as memories from his past resurfaced. When he walked into a diner as a child, the waitress only told him, "We don't serve your kind here." His mother gripped his hand tightly, whispering, "Keep your head high, Kevin." Now, decades later, the people who had always seen him as less than were about to need him more than they had ever imagined. Inside the room, Richard Brown's anger was palpable. "We'll find another donor," he said firmly. "There has to be someone else." Dr. James sighed. "We don't have time. Lucas's condition is worsening. If we delay any further, we could lose him." Margaret's voice wavered. "Richard, please. He's our son." Richard's hands trembled. Accepting Kevin's blood meant accepting a truth he had spent his life denying. That race didn't matter in the end, that the person he had spent years despising was now his son's only hope. Finally, Richard exhaled sharply, turning to face Dr. James. Fine, do it. The words left his mouth like they had been dragged out by force. Kevin stepped into the room. The moment his dark skin contrasted with the pale white walls, Richard averted his gaze, unable to meet his eyes. Kevin studied the man in front of him, the same man who had sneered at him in public, who had once muttered racial slurs under his breath when Kevin passed by. And yet, here they were. "Let's save your son," Kevin said, calm but firm. He wasn't doing it for Richard. He wasn't even doing it for redemption. He was doing it because he was a doctor, and more than that, because he was human. But would this act of kindness change anything? Or would it be just another moment erased by hate? Chapter 3. A Life on the Line. The operating room was prepped, the machines humming softly as nurses moved with practiced urgency. Dr. Kevin sat in a chair beside the hospital bed, a needle already inserted into his arm, his blood flowing through a tube into a collection bag. It was surreal. His very essence, the blood that had once made him a target of discrimination, was now the only thing that could save the life of a man whose family had despised him. Lucas lay unconscious, unaware of the turmoil raging around him. His body was weak, his skin pale, his breathing shallow. The doctors had mere minutes to begin the transfusion before his condition worsened beyond repair. Kevin glanced up and saw Richard standing just outside the glass window. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment before Richard looked away, arms crossed, his face a mask of stubborn resistance. The man who had once judged Kevin for the color of his skin was now watching that very same skin provide the lifeline his son needed. Margaret approached cautiously, her hands folded in front of her. "Thank you," she murmured, barely above a whisper. Kevin nodded, but said nothing. He wasn't doing this for gratitude. He was doing it because he had made a vow to heal, regardless of who stood before him. The transfusion began. The red fluid traveled from Kevin's body into Lucas's veins, carrying more than just oxygen and nutrients. It carried history, struggle, and sacrifice. It was a bridge between two worlds that had always been divided. For the next few hours, the tension in the hospital was suffocating. Richard remained silent, his fingers tapping against his arm in agitation. He hadn't protested further, but his discomfort was obvious. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lucas's vitals stabilized. His pulse grew more substantial, the color returned to his face, and his breathing became more regular. The doctors exchanged relieved glances. He had made it through the worst. Kevin removed the needle from his arm, pressing a piece of gauze against the tiny wound. His body was exhausted, but his mind was still restless. Would Lucas wake up and see the truth? Would Richard finally realize that hate had no place when life was on the line? Or would this moment be nothing more than a brief pause in an endless cycle of prejudice? As Kevin stood to leave, Richard finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Why did you do it?" Kevin turned, meeting the older man's gaze. There was no anger in his expression, no resentment, just quiet resolve. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. And with that, he walked away, leaving behind a man who had no choice but to rethink everything he had ever believed. The room was silent, except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Lucas Brown's eyelids fluttered, his fingers twitching as he slowly regained consciousness. His body felt weak, as if he had been asleep for days. The last thing he remembered was unbearable pain and the blurry faces of his worried parents. As his vision cleared, he saw them. His mother, Margaret, sitting beside him, clutching his hand tightly. His father, Richard, stood stiffly in the corner, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Margaret gasped when she saw his eyes open. "Lucas!" "Oh, thank God!" she whispered, her voice cracking with relief. She squeezed his hand, her warmth grounding him in reality. Lucas tried to speak, but his throat was dry. His mother quickly brought him a cup of water, and he took slow sips, feeling the cool liquid soothe him. As he gathered his thoughts, his mind drifted to a question. How was he still alive? Then he noticed a figure in the doorway. Dr. Kevin. He was a tall, composed man with dark skin who wore his white coat like a badge of honor. His expression was not proud or smug. It was quiet observation. Lucas frowned slightly, confusion flashing across his face. You... His voice was hoarse. You're my doctor? Kevin nodded. Yes, and I was also your blood donor. Silence. Lucas's mind struggled to process those words. A black man saved me? It wasn't disgust he felt, nor anger, just shock. His father had always spoken about people like Kevin with disdain. His family had built their identity, believing that races should remain separate. And yet, here he was, alive because that belief had been proven wrong. Margaret swallowed hard, her gaze shifting between Kevin and Lucas. He saved your life, Lucas. Lucas turned to his father. Richard's jaw was tight, and his knuckles were white because he gripped his arm hard. He hadn't said a word, but the turmoil in his eyes was evident. For years, Lucas had followed in his father's footsteps, believing what he was told and never questioning it. But now, the man before him, the man who had saved him, was standing tall, not expecting gratitude, but acknowledging the truth. Lucas took a deep breath. Thank you. It was just 2 words, but they carried the weight of generations in that hospital room. Kevin nodded, but he didn't linger for praise. He turned and walked away, leaving Lucas and his family to wrestle with the undeniable reality. The walls they had built between themselves and people like him had just crumbled. Richard remained silent, his face still hard, but Lucas could see the conflict in his father's eyes. Maybe this was the moment that would change everything. The air in the hospital room was thick with unspoken words. Lucas could feel the tension radiating from his father, who still hadn't moved from his corner. Margaret sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap, stealing glances at her husband. Lucas shifted in his bed. His body was still weak, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had spent his whole life following his father's beliefs, never questioning what he was taught. But now, faced with the truth of his survival, those beliefs felt like a heavy chain around his neck. Say something, Dad. Lucas finally spoke, his voice more potent than before. Richard exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. You don't understand, son, he muttered. It's not that simple. Lucas's brows furrowed. Not simple? A man you've hated my entire life just saved me. I'm alive because of him. What's not simple about that? Richard's fists clenched. It's not about hate. Then what is it about? Lucas cut in, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks exactly like hate. Richard's face darkened, but he had no immediate response. For the first time, Lucas saw something new in his father's expression. Doubt. Margaret, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. We raised you to believe in certain things, Lucas. We thought we were protecting you. She hesitated, her voice trembling. But maybe we were wrong. Lucas's heart pounded at those words. His mother, the woman who had always supported his father's beliefs, was questioning them. It was subtle, but it was there. A crack in the foundation. You were wrong, Lucas said, his voice steady. And you still have a chance to make it right. Richard's gaze flickered, his jaw tightening as he looked away. The weight of decades of prejudice didn't disappear in a single moment, but something had changed. Lucas could see it. For the first time in his life, his father did not argue. Lucas exhaled deeply, gazing toward the hospital door where Dr. Kevin had stood moments ago. The man who had done the unthinkable, not just saving his life, but forcing him and his family to face the truth. This could be the moment that would define the rest of their lives. And maybe it was the beginning of something new. The days passed slowly, but Lucas's condition improved. The hospital room became a place of quiet reflection, not just for him, but also for his family. Richard Brown, a man known for his stubbornness, had spoken little since that night. His silence was not one of anger, but of conflict, an internal battle between the beliefs he had carried all his life and the undeniable truth of his son's survival. Lucas had always idolized his father. He believed in his strength and wisdom, but now, for the first time, he saw Richard as something else, a man trapped by his own past, a prisoner of an outdated ideology. One evening, as the sun cast long shadows through the hospital window, a soft knock echoed in the room. Dr. Kevin stepped inside, his expression calm but professional. "How are you feeling, Lucas?" he asked, scanning the vitals on the monitor. "Better," Lucas said, sitting up a little straighter. His voice carried something new, determination. "Thanks to you." Kevin met his gaze, nodding slightly. "That's what I'm here for." An awkward silence followed. Richard sat stiffly in the chair by the window, his fingers tapping against the armrest. Kevin turned to leave, sensing the tension, but Lucas spoke up before he could. "Wait." Kevin paused. Lucas took a deep breath, then looked at his father. "Dad, you have something to say, don't you?" Richard's jaw tightened. His eyes met Kevin's for the first time since the transfusion. It was a look filled with decades of history, of resentment, ingrained prejudice, and something new, a hesitant acknowledgement. Richard started, but the words failed him. He wasn't a man who apologized quickly, especially not to someone he had spent years seeing as inferior. Lucas pushed. "Say it." Richard exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know how to change overnight." His voice was rough but honest. "But I do know one thing. My son wouldn't be alive if it weren't for you." Kevin remained silent, waiting. Richard swallowed hard. "I won't lie and say I understand everything. I won't pretend I suddenly see the world differently. But—" he hesitated, then finally met Kevin's gaze. "Thank you." The words were heavy, like they had been pulled from a place Richard had buried deep inside. Kevin studied the man in front of him, recognizing the struggle. Change didn't happen in a moment and didn't erase the past, but it had to start somewhere. "You're welcome," Kevin said. He didn't offer forgiveness, because that wasn't his to give, but he did offer something else, a chance. Lucas watched the exchange, a strange sense of hope settling in his chest. Maybe his father would never entirely change. Perhaps scars of the past may have run too deep, but tonight, in this small moment, something had shifted, and sometimes that was enough to begin a new path. As Kevin left the room, Lucas looked at his father again. "It's never too late, Dad." Richard didn't reply, but for the first time, he didn't dismiss the idea either. Lucas was discharged from the hospital a week later. His body had regained strength, but his mind was still restless. The world outside the hospital walls remained unchanged, yet something inside him had changed. His father's hesitant thank you to Dr. Kevin echoed in his mind. Was it enough? Could a single act of kindness break years of hatred? As the Browns stepped out of the hospital, their tension lingered. Margaret was quieter than usual, stealing glances at Richard as if waiting for him to say anything that would prove he had truly begun to change. But Richard remained as he always was, his face unreadable. Lucas, however, wasn't willing to let things slide. Not this time. The drive home was silent, but as soon as they pulled into the driveway, Lucas turned to his father. "We need to talk." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Lucas, you just got out of the hospital." "No, Dad. No more excuses. We need to talk about this now." Margaret hesitated before nodding. "He's right, Richard." Richard clenched his jaw but didn't argue. Instead, he stepped inside the house and sank into his usual armchair, his fingers drumming against the wooden armrest. "All right," he muttered. "Say what you need to say." Lucas took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. You always taught me that our family was better, that people like Dr. Kevin weren't like us. He paused, searching his father's face for a reaction. But if that's true, why am I alive because of him? Richard flinched, but he didn't look away. You said it's not about hate, Lucas continued. But what else can you call it? You refused to let his blood save me at first. You've spent your whole life avoiding people like him, looking down on them. And now that he's proven you wrong, you don't even know how to handle it, do you? Richard's fingers stopped tapping. His expression darkened, not with anger, but with something else. Shame. Lucas! No, Lucas interrupted. I'm not saying you have to change overnight. I'm not even saying you have to like Dr. Kevin. But if you walk away from this and pretend nothing happened, if you keep living as you did before, what was the point of me surviving? Silence. Margaret sniffled, wiping her eyes. He's right, Richard, she whispered. I've been thinking about it too. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe you were wrong. Richard exhaled sharply, his gaze dropping to the floor. He had spent his life believing in a world that no longer existed, a world where people like Kevin and people like him didn't mix, a world where race defined worth. But now that belief had been shattered. I don't know how to change, Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've lived this way for so long. I don't know how to be anything else. Lucas stared at his father, and for the first time, he didn't see a strong, unwavering man. He saw someone lost. You start small, Lucas said. You question things. You stop assuming you're always right. You listen. Richard's shoulders slumped, the weight of decades pressing down on him. And if I fail? Then you try again, Lucas said. The room was heavy with emotion, but something had shifted. Richard Brown, who had once sworn he would never trust their kind, was now questioning everything he had ever known. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and it wasn't a grand redemption arc, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, that was enough. Days passed, and though life returned to normal in many ways, something between the Browns had undeniably changed. Lucas noticed how his father hesitated before speaking, as if weighing his words more carefully. He saw it in the way Margaret watched Richard, hopeful yet uncertain, as though waiting for proof that the shift in him was fundamental. But change, Lucas knew, wasn't instant. It was a slow, painful process, one that required effort. One evening, Lucas was scrolling through his phone, his thoughts drifting back to the hospital. Dr. Kevin had done something extraordinary, saving his life and forcing his family to confront their deeply ingrained prejudices. Lucas wondered what Kevin thought of it all, if he even expected Richard to change. A part of him wanted to reach out, to say something. But what? Hey, thanks for saving my life. My racist dad might be rethinking his life choices because of you. That didn't seem right. Instead, he decided to take a step forward. Doctor? Kevin? I don't know if you remember me. I just wanted to say thank you again. Not just for saving my life, but for making me see things differently. Let's talk sometime. He hesitated before hitting send. Would Kevin even respond? Would he even care? A few moments later, his phone vibrated. I remember you, Lucas. I'm glad to hear from you. Change starts with small steps. I'd be happy to talk. Lucas exhaled, a small smile forming on his lips. Meanwhile, in the living room, Richard sat in his chair, staring at the news playing on the TV. For the first time in years, he wasn't just watching. He was listening. Stories about racial injustice, people like Kevin, and the things he had dismissed his entire life. Margaret sat beside him, glancing at him cautiously. You okay? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sighed, rubbing his face. I don't know who I am anymore, Margaret. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Maybe that's a good thing. Richard didn't pull away. For the first time in his life, he wasn't clinging to the past. He wasn't justifying his beliefs. For the first time, he was allowing himself to question. And sometimes, that was how change truly began. Enjoyed this story? Don't forget to like this video, Share it with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Let's spread the message of hope and unity together. Thanks and take care.